And thanks everyone for joining us today. And welcome to the fourth annual Jan van Sina lecture. It's really difficult, at least for me, to believe that it's been nearly 5 years since Jan passed away. I think it's safe to say that this annual lecture has now entered into the realm of tradition in the African Studies program. And I hope that this lecture serves as a way to keep alive the memory of Jan's enduring contributions to the program and to the field of African studies more broadly. As many of you likely know, Jan van Sina was most well known for his works on the early histories of Central Africa, and also, of course, his pioneering efforts in the use of oral traditions as sources for writing early African history. What some of you might not know, however, is that one of Jan's many side interests was African art history. And in this case, Jan, turned this side interest into the publication in 1984 of Art History in Africa, an Introduction to Method. And for those of you who knew Jan, it probably won't come as a surprise that at the time of its publication, this book was actually considered by many to be a seminal contribution to the field of African art history. The reason I mention this is because I think that today's speaker, Yala Kisukidi, in many respects brings together Jan's interest in philosophies of governance and in art in Central Africa. Interestingly, Yala was actually supposed to come to Madison last year for a conference that we had planned on decolonization in Francophone Africa that was organized by my colleagues Aliko Songolo and Jason Yaki. Unfortunately, that conference, like many others, was canceled due to COVID, but I'd like to thank Aliko for putting us in touch with Yala and for suggesting that she would be a really good candidate for the Jan van Sina lecture this year. So Yala Kisukidi, this year's Jan van Sina lecturer, is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Paris Vincent Saint-Denis in University. She was also the Vice President of the Collège International de Philosophie from 2014 to 2016. She's currently a member of the editorial committee of the Critical Time series at Duke University, and also on the editorial board for Les Cahiers d'études africaines. She's also currently the co-author of the Yango 2 Biennial, which will take place at Kinshasa in November 2021 and January 2022. Professor Kisukidi specializes in French and African philosophy. She's published many articles and books, both monographed and edited volumes in the field of philosophy. And she's currently preparing a book due out in early 2023 on Africana philosophy. So please join me in welcoming Yala Kisukidi. Welcome, Yala.
Hi, welcome. Thank you very much for your warm welcome. And I really wanted to be with you for this session because I was so honored to have been invited last year to this great event. I think last year or before, I don't remember, but for this great event about decolonization of knowledges. But unfortunately, due to the COVID-19, it was not possible. So even if it's virtual, we are all together here. I wanted to thank very warmly Professor Nikodesh for this invitation, and just to say again that I'm very honored to be there for this Jan van Sina lecture. So what I will do now is that I am writing this book, my book, and these are some excerpts of the book I am writing now, and it's about it's a book of philosophy, but it's about how to reread philosophically, perhaps some parts or some expressions of the political struggles that took place in the Congo, of course, from the beginning of the movements of for the independence. And we will have to ask, what is this beginning historically until now? And the question of the legacy, the intellectual legacies, and how we can understand this idea of intellectual legacy is at the core of the work I am doing now. So the title of this lecture has a little bit changed. It's more, I would say, it's more, it's less difficult to understand, but you will see what it means. I'm trying to share my screen. Just give me a little second. so you can see what it is. So the title is just Waking Dreams. And I'm starting now. I hope I won't be too long. It's supposed to be a 40 minutes lecture, but I will try to shorten it a little. So thank you. So waking dreams. We suffer through dreams and are cured by dreams, as says the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard. In the 19th century in Europe, an entire body of scientific literature studied the phenomena of dreamlike lucidity. In 1867, the Marquis d'Hervé de Saint-Denis published a book entitled Dreams and How to Guide Them. To understand dreams, to examine the solidarity that is established between life's actions and sleep's illusions, to show that will is not without action on the numerous twists and turns of our imaginary existence, dreamlike lucidity is specified in at least two ways. There are conscious dreams, we can be conscious of dreaming, but above all, when it is dreaming, the mind is perceptive. It sees what remained veiled in a waking state, a sense of premonition or a greater clarity of images that line up without moral or social control in one's own intimacy. Dreamlike lucidity can thus be understood in an almost sociological way. With Freud, censorship and repressions are powerful principles for the explanation of the dream. However, research in social science on domination shows, Bourdieu or James C. Scott, for example, shows that censorship is not exercised in the same way in all enunciative contexts. The French sociologist Bernard Lahire thus states that, I quote, censorship, both formal and moral, is absent from the dream. We are obliged by nothing when we are sleeping. We don't have to be intelligible to express ourselves logically, to be heard by a third party or ourselves. Dreaming is an activity of the psyche that escapes social disapproval. Thus, in the intimate space of the sleeper, everything loosens up. The world of the dream is not a space of repression of images, of desires that a subject would conceal in daytime public life to make a good impression and or to conform to a set of majoritarian dominant social norms. Social life is not absent from the dream, but it engages in it uninhibitedly, multiplying its gifts or its cruelties. While the dream sometimes opens the door to perceptive viewpoints, it is because the repressive social forces which are exerted on the psyche of sleeping bodies loosen up. An unpoliced space is deployed wherein order is not maintained and offenses are not punished, a territory without uniforms nor military caps. In everyday language, the dream refers to an ideal projection imagined in a waking state. Dreamers are not considered to be very productive or being men of actions. Within the political field, the whole semantics of the dream is spontaneously disqualified. Nevertheless, it is possible to aesthetically, philosophically, and politically re-signify the state of conscious dreamers. In l'interprétation des rêves dans la tradition africaine, Ray Otra analyzes the plural forms of dream criticism in West Africa. For the Mandinka, each human being possesses a dameleke, an immortal double who stays awake and never sleeps. The dream is thus the projection of actions experienced by the dameleke over the course of their peregrinations, while the human body sleeps deeply. The dream presupposes the existence of two worlds, that of the dozing body and that of the mind, and the dreamer paradoxically experiences an inverted world. When dreams become lucid, The mind is conscious of being on its feet in the middle of the night, of moving around, of crossing lands, of surveying other expenses and other countries. It keeps the memory of its nocturnal journeys when sunrise comes. Frederik van Eeden, a Dutch poet and psychotherapist, offers a materialistic version of these lucid journeys of the mind. The lucid dream must be considered as, I quote, the assumption of a double body, the body of the dream separating itself from the body of the sleeper to float and rise up before re-entering it, giving the sleeper great bliss. The dream is not exclusively defined from hardly intelligible temporal sequences. The dream also produces spaces and places where the mind-body settles and roams. The lucid dreams is the awareness that the body and or the mind travel freely within dreamlike spaces, breaking with the space-time continuum of daily life. The space of the dream does not have the structure of a panopticon. No body of control patrols the wanderings of the dreamer. This place is not the non-space of utopia, which depicts a rational and generalized improvement of human societies. It is a place weaved out of extra dreams elements in which the second body ventures while the first body, subject to social habits, dozes. Neither is this space a heterotopia, since the places of dream have neither real anchoring nor physical borders. This space is sometimes the rearranged world of the day before, in which the body of the dreamer is wholly projected. This recomposition of the world deserves to take place in the social world, the one in which policing norms spy on beings, stopping and containing their motion. Let's return to Central Africa after those first explications about the question of the dream, of the waking dream. The shores of the Black Atlantic are full of lucid dreams, tensioning the world of day and the inverted world of night. The technologies of violence have structured the spaces of Caribbean, American colonial plantation societies around hierarchies of contempt, race, gender, etc., which objectify bodies and wreck lives. The Black archives of the liberation, music, arts, texts, insurrectional and institutional practices have imagined and traced multiple landscapes wherein bodies recovered their subjectivity and started to dream again. The journey is the materiality of the dream. Dreamers travel through a space that is quite unlike the ordinary world, and when they return, they push hard to break out of the given in order to extend, sometimes collectively, the unprecedented nature of their adventure. Alternative worlds exist and they deserve a terrestrial place, such is the daytime stubbornness of lucid dreamers. But I don't want to start out from the experience of the chasm, to quote Edouard Glissant. I would like to stay on firm ground without roaming the Atlantic. My feet rooted in the African continent, paying attention to those who stayed and who also had to confront, but in another way, these hierarchies of contempt. It is true that the African continent rarely appears in the global imagination as a matrix providing lucid dreams. Arendt, a reader of Joseph Conrad, reminds us how the imagination and practices of colonists, Africa, the continent of darkness, was considered as this savage otherness, this phantom world of race, where little white gods believed that everything was allowed. It is indeed, firstly, through the tropes which Mudimbe called the colonial library, that the reality of the continent has long been grasped. Here is now how Mudimbe defined the colonial library. You all know, but I'm quoting him. Exploiting travelers and explorers' writing at the end of the 19th century, a colonial library begins to take shape. It represents a body of knowledge constructed with the explicit purpose of faithfully translating and deciphering the African object. Indeed, it fulfilled a political project in which supposedly the object unveils its being, its secrets, and its potential to master who could finally domesticate it. Certainly, the depth as well as the ambition of the colonial library disseminates the concept of deviation as the best symbol of the idea of Africa. This order of knowledge has produced an idea of Africa conceived as the negative of the West. Africa, a negativity then. To get out of the order of the negative, Africa must be saved by itself. To specify Africa as negativity, thus possesses a double descriptive and normative dimension. It's about describing radical otherness. It's about ensuring that this otherness becomes other than it effectively is. Such is the meaning of the colonial gaze that unwittingly tries to save. By staying focused on this colonial library, the matrix of our inquiry also remains negative and critical, producing questions such as, how do you get out of the colonial library? How do you produce an African order of knowledge? How do you not repeat the images and representations that come out of this library in the bodies of knowledge that themselves lay claim to liberation? Through these questions, we remain focused on the colonist negative eye. It is nevertheless not enough, as Mutimbe has well and truly shown, to turn the discourses produced from the African continent in order to get out of this library, because a large number of them have been infected by it. However, without naivety, we can examine the time of positivities produced by some of them. Indeed, they don't all frantically position themselves as anti-European, Europe having become the omnipresent point of reference. They don't all confront the European anthropological knowledge that makes Africa an object without subjects. They don't all lose themselves in an impossible circle, how to think about oneself through categories that one did not come up with. Some of them allow us to grasp a political or intellectual moment that opens in all its positivity. From them, it becomes possible to conceive how the continent in the 20th century has been a great source of political, aesthetic, and intellectual utopias, a great source of waking dreams. Seen from the former French power, the independence of African countries, I hope I'm not talking too fast because I know my lecture is quite long, so I'm trying to say everything, but I will try to slow a little. Seen from the former French power, the independence of African countries is often tied to one date, reduced to 1 year, 1960. One date and then nothing. We know the history and the conceptual distinctions that this date, fixed in the marble of historical chronologies, dragged along with it. The independence of African countries were formal and not real. What was put in place, as Sartre said in a famous text from 1956, colonialism is a system, is neo-colonialism. By neo-colonialism, we can understand in a wide sense the continuous intervention, militarily, financially, economically, ideologically, and culturally, of imperial powers in the domestic affairs of former colonies. Namely, strict colonialism that mobilizes other means than those of direct territorial administration by the European metropolitan country. What the independence of African countries was pointing to was well and truly a defeat and not a dream. Nevertheless, those who were defeated fought. And before we stick to the effects of combat, we should perhaps follow the collective dynamics that carried them there. These dynamics appear like so many waking dreams. If dreams are constructed off stage, they sometimes take on a collective dimension. When a segment of the population is subject to forms, a systematic, material, or symbolic violence exerted by a dominant majority, lucid dreams become collective cultural products, to quote James C. Scott. They call for the inversion of the world, in other words, the radical dismantling of structures of oppression. There are no lucid dreams without explosions, and the independence of African countries were such explosions. Explosions, what do I mean by this term? The uninterrupted police pressure on subordinated bodies overheats the mind until the day when that no longer holds. The contained energy is free, generating with high intensity other possible configurations of the world. Whether they are peaceful or armed, these dreamlike explosions provide new ways to rip through space. They are not pure negations, but upheavals. Each of them converts the daytime forms and figures of power. The political history of violence is always accompanied by another story, that of the prevented or effective explosion of collective dreams. The imaginary discharges that are released are submitted neither to the law of homogeneity nor to the order of the quantifiable. Dreaming is not about producing a program, but roaming the ground of a territory that has become inhabitable. The categories of entrenchment, of subjectivity in its absolute dimension, of ideality or of abstraction are not suitable for contemplating the politics of lucid dreams. The lucid dreams does not move across facts, it hits into the real and reclaims its physical inscription in the folds of matter. If there is a refusal, it is that of realism, which in politics rejects the possibility of new rearrangements of the world, namely the effectiveness of projections and practices that dismantles forms of domination. The lucid dreams is a refusal, the refusal of the unjust and implacable given, but it is also an escape, a gap that undoes the totality of what is. As a result, the real no longer appears like a prison where subaltern groups are condemned to bow down. The proposition is not idealistic, rather it is rich in material effects. No transformative politics without lucid dreamers. It is about catching a glimpse of madness, the possibility of a world that does not remain as it is. Patrice Emery Lumumba one day had a dream. It took the form of a long and unique poem that still booms like an explosion. I will read it in French because it was written in French, but I have the translation on the screen, the English translation, or I can read it in English. It will be easier just to have the two languages. Yeah, let's read it in English. Oh, black man, beast of burden through the centuries, your ashes scattered to the winds of heaven. There was a time when you built burial temples in which your murderers sleep their final sleep. Hunted down and tracked, driven from your homes, beaten in battles where brute force prevailed, barbaric centuries of rape and carnage that offered you the choice of death or slavery. You went for refuge to the forest depth, and other deaths waylaid you, burning fevers, jaws of wild beasts, the cold, unholy coals of snakes who crushed you gradually to death. Then came the white man, more clever, tricky, cruel. He took your gold in trade for shoddy stuff. He raped your women, made your warriors drunk, penned up your sons and daughters on his ships. The tom-toms hummed through all the villages, spreading afar the mourning, the wild grief at news of exile to a distant land where cotton is God and the dollar king. Condemned to enforced labor, beast of burden, under a burning sun from dawn to dusk, so that you might forget you are a man. They taught you to sing the praises of their God, and these hosannas tuned into your sorrows, gave you the hope of a better world to come. But in your human heart, you only asked the right to live your share of happiness. Beside your fire, your eyes reflect your dreams and suffering. You sung the chants that gave voice to your blues, and sometimes to your joys when sap rose in the trees, and you danced wildly in the damp of evening. And out of this sprung forth, magnificent, alive and virile, like a bell of brass, sounding your sorrow, that powerful music, jazz now loved, admired throughout the world, compelling the white man to respect, announcing in clear, loud tones from this time on, this country no longer belongs to him. And thus, you made the brothers of your race lift up their heads to see clear, straight ahead, the happy future bearing deliverance. The banks of a great river in flower with hope are yours from this time onward. The earth and all its riches are yours from this time onward. The blazing sun in the colorless sky dissolves our sorrow in a wave of warmth. Its burning rays will help to dry forever the flood of tears shed by our ancestors, martyrs of the tyranny of the masters. And on this earth, which you will always love, you will make the Congo a nation, happy and free, in the very heart of the vast Black Africa. This poem is taken from the Journal of de l'Indépendance of the MNC, and it was written in September 1959. This poem by Lumumba was written 1 year before the independence of what would become, after the Belgian Congo, the Republic of the Congo, amid pain and blood. But this independence, whose future was tragic, was nourished by immense collective dreams that never stopped supporting it and being reactivated subsequently. Lumumba's dream, which unfolds in the only poem that he ever published, exemplifies the density of this dream. Beyond the style, admittedly marked by the great writers of the negritude, what is expressed is tectonics. The Black Americas and Africa have never been separated by an ocean. They form one and the same continent. The Atlantic is not the chasm as described by Glissant. Such is the truth carried by the dreams of independence. Independence in this poem by Lumumba doesn't exclusively concern Africa. It concerns Black men and women considered as the dispersed African people. This independence bears the memory as well as the vision of the future, the memory of all the forms of violence that the continent has experienced, a political vision of reparation. The lands of the Congo bear with them the wounds of the slave trade. Central Africa's encounter with the West, which started in the 15th century, the era when the Eurocentric order and a certain consciousness of global space was instituted, opened a cycle of extraordinary violence, to quote Isidore Daiwell, in repeated patterns of collapse. Because words can indeed collapse several times. The slave trade developed after the arrival of the Portuguese in the Congo in the 15th century. The kidnapping and enslavement, along with the drain on the labor force, destabilized local institutions and demographics. African lands were turned into a huge reservoir of manual labor, feeding trade channels that were becoming increasingly international. In the 19th century, explorers and colonial societies competed on African soil in the name of European states. The Conference of Berlin in 1885 established the legal terms of the European occupation of Africa, guaranteeing the sovereignty of each European nation and granting them all complete freedom of trade. This conference, which consolidated the rules of commercial imperialism that developed in Africa throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, is to be understood as the point in time when the European states imposed capitalism on the coast of Africa. In the Congo Basin, by then the property of the King of Belgium, rubber exploitation led to violent forms of extractivism that included the destructions of villages, the appropriation of land, the massacre and mutilation of local populations, the destabilization of collective life, forced labor, and the exploitation of natural resources to profit foreign companies. Congolese lands fueled the development of the Second Industrial Revolution in Europe. Lumumba's dream in the poem from 1959 is the remembrance of all its history of the Congo, the long history of appropriation of bodies and theft of land. To be independent is well and truly to be sovereign, to possess a state, to administer their riches and property, but more powerfully yet is it to take back their land and reclaim their own. Such is the meaning of Lumumba's waking dream. Africa must demand the return of their own, those who have experienced the betrayal of the Atlantic, to quote the psychoanalyst Rita Segato. The betrayal of the Atlantic, whose complicit waves carried away the slave ships and never allowed their occupants to make the return journey. They must demand the return of their own and offer them inhabitable land. The independence is the political sign of a waking dream, where the Congo, welcoming those who have returned, reunites dispersed families, reestablishing the tie between the deported and those who remained. It thus becomes a land of refuge, that is to say, a land where conquering Europe no longer kills, where Black and African lives are no longer diminished. What have those dreams become? What have these dreams become? It would seem that they have crumbled away with the failure of African independencies. Lumumba's dream has sunk into the history of post-colonial Congo. The two Congo wars, which gripped the region with violence in the late 20th century and have continued into the first quarter of the 21st, have accompanied the revolution of digital electronics, with Congolese mineral resources being introduced into the global market. The systemic violence raging in the DRC supports an international supply system coupled with a form of national and regional redistribution of resources, to quote Kameni. Mass massacres, the forced displacement of population, rape, the increased vulnerability of human life, etc. The North-South divide is too broad to account for the conflictuality of worlds. The economy of pillage and extraction that has taken a hold on the region is supported by international industrial and financial predations, but also by intra-African alliances and a revenue system maintained by national elites. The dreams have sunk, faced with their impossible actualization. However, we would be wrong to believe that they remain stuck in a past date, on this famous year of 1960, which seems to have wanted to make a non-event of the independence. We should perhaps dwell here on the modes of survival of such dreams. Often, survivals take a path, that of a story, but not any story. Trinte Minha marks a distinction between story and history in the Grandma's Story chapter of her book, Woman Native Author. There is history as an accumulation of events supporting paternal authority, that which makes it an event for the whole community. And little stories that no legitimization body validates and that are reserved for children passed down by grandmothers. Grandmothers are storytellers. They develop channels to pass down stories that are separate from history as fatherly lessons, and inscribe those who listen to them in a narrative network which operates their subjectification in a non-authoritarian mode, neither education nor training, but joyful listening. When the collection of small stories that shaped subjectivity supply the figurative imaginary thread of a material claim, it turns into a political force. The passing down of little accounts contributes to the formation of political subjectivities. They are not always constructed through the realization of multiple police, race, gender, class, summons which produce them socially. In this way, in the post-colonial situation, the defeats from big history, the death of the patriarchs at the hands of colonial violence, did not prevent the continuous transmission of small, non-written stories through the intervention of women. They have sometimes taken the path of family intimacy. They are irremediable losses, but it is rare that we take an interest in what we are told in the intimacy of the family, and particularly, as Shrimina reminds us, in what all women tell us. Despite the irreparable loss fatherhoods were well and truly defeated, they maintain the passing down of little stories, enabling the proliferation of political self-fabulation. Political self-fabulation does not bring about any totalization of individual experience. Its problem is not who am I, but rather how does what has been told to me situate me and get me moving. These forms of fabulation are political. They are not melancholic. They continue to produce narrative threads in a world that provides no future horizons. Thus, beneath the great historic defeats, the small stories remain, which are passed down by word of mouth from grandparents to children,
like poems that we recite or hear, bearing witness to a bygone age, which remains, however, in people's minds. The independencies don't belong only to great history, frozen still as an official date. They also shape family histories that are passed down from generation to generation. As a result of their passing down, these dreams are never extinguished. They cannot be contained by the prosaicism of the chronologies of defeat. From these small, non-official stories, perspectives change. We would perhaps be wrong to let ourselves be subjugated everywhere by the melancholy of mourning and defeat. There were, however, living memories remain, little stories that are passed down as points of survival. Another history of independence, embodied and dreamlike, can be written that reflects its still active and creative potentialities. Despite the political muddle and the cruelties that reign in the lands of the diaspora and across continents, we have to be able to contemplate the survival of dreams despite their fading apart. Not independence as a date, but as a process nearing completion. Just 5 words to conclude. What am I doing now? I would say that I am doing and trying to practice philosophy. And what can be here the aim of philosophy? What can be philosophy towards its relationship to this African history of independence and to African historiography? First, perhaps to reread by resurrecting what was held to be dead, by understanding the eventness of what was held as a non-event. Second, perhaps to rethink the idea of diaspora, not through the idea of lost filiations, but through intellectual and political legacies, through the legacies here of waking dreams. And third, such is the significance of Laetitia Africana, to rethink the idea of legacies, intellectual legacies, legacies that are not secretly kept into blood, race, and closed identities, but through the continuous transmission of political dreams. I will just end with a question. Why should I still reclaim the word philosophy? To me, philosophy does not mean exclusively to produce an analytical and critical task, or even to produce a meta text about the archives. It means here, and it was the aim of this text, in a perspective opened by contemporary theoretical feminism, try to rethink human practices toward the living experience of the body, of the intimate body. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Yala, very much for that very provocative and interesting talk. The forum is now open for questions. There are 2 ways. You can raise your hand, or you can type a question in the chat, and I will read it for you. So it's open, and let me see who would like to ask the first question. Ron Rodano.
Yes, hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I have a question relating to your conception of and your articulation of the 19th century colonial archive as a formation of the negative, which is clear and obvious. I'm also wondering, though, of the extent to which that conception, particularly in relation to dreams, is also the opposite of a kind of hyper-positive that Europeans were not able to access. And I was, this came to mind when you were describing in this formulation of dreams, of Freud's notion of unheimlich, and in Totem and Taboo, where there's a sense that Africa is a place where one can discover qualities that are missing from condition of European civilization, and that this figuration of unheimlich would also be, as it's translated as uncanny in English, as a place where Europe can access through extraction a world that is missing, and to what extent do you think that might be a part of this formulation of dreams, that the dream is in your formulation not only a negative but also something that's missing from Europe, because so much of your formulation at the outset is really seems to be coming from European philosophy. So I'm wondering how that really helps you to understand Africa as a place that's missing from Europe, and to what extent does that formulation then determine your thinking about the concept of dream lucidity and the rest?
Yeah, thank you for this very important question. You are true, but and I would say, I mean, it's a very it's a lecture that is really rooted in a very precise conception of dreams. And I didn't quote the author, but it's from Ernst Bloch. Ernst Bloch, I think, is a great philosopher who really create a kind of a philosophy of waking dreams. All the big books he wrote, it is, I don't know how it is translated in English, but it's the Hope Principle, perhaps in English, Le Principe Espérance in French. He's about the question of the waking dreams and how to translate them politically. And my aim as a philosopher, I don't know, perhaps I don't want to be too caricatural, but I'm also European. And my aim is not to just create a philosophy completely rooted, for example, in African, I don't know, in African philosophy, for example, but I'm on this strange place, completely mixed, that is the place of the diaspora. So I pick everything that I need just to create something. So I don't know if it was really the core of the question, but I think that I don't know why I should not use, for example, Freud or Bloch or other authors, just to be able to rethink or to reinterpret this question of independence. And what's more, and I think that I'm very happy that you asked this question, because it's very important. They are not a kind of, they are not the framework through which I read the independence. It is combined with, of course, other thinkers that are not subordinate to these great European masters, that are completely intertwined with their thinking. It's just a part of the text. I'm sorry, because I read it very quickly, but there are other authors that I'm using in this, for example, in this work, that are absolutely not European, that are also reshaping perhaps the ideas of utopia, etc., etc. So I don't know if I really answered to your question. Don't hesitate to tell me if it was not the right, not really what you asked for, but I don't have the impression that to use this conception of dream is a problem when we are trying to reinterpret this question of the history of Africa, and especially the history of what we could call the defeat of the independence.
Yeah, it's not, if I could just follow up briefly, it's not really the idea that you're using European texts and that's inappropriate. I'm not suggesting that at all, but it's this formulation of a realm that is inaccessible from Europe, that is part of a kind of dream state in Europe. And to what extent does that kind of dreaminess of Africa as both a negative and a hyper positive suggest something about your formulation of dreams in your own analysis? I'm wondering to what extent does the dream, the conception of the dream, get changed as a consequence of thinking of it in those terms?
Yeah, I think because it's not the dark continent of the psychoanalysis that I'm talking about. And it's true that I think perhaps that your what was interesting to me with the critique of the criticism of Freud was to be able to emphasize a sociological understanding of the dreams, and to put this idea of dream in a political to give to waking dream political signification. That was what at the core of what I wanted to say. And of course, I told you, you have Hans Bloor that did it in the 19th century, but the psychological and psychoanalytic dimension of the dream is not at the core of this political understanding of the independence. So I would say that I'm not sure that it would change something, and I'm not sure that I would root my lecture in such a hermeneutic of the archive of the 19th century. If this was your question, if it was your question, yeah.
Great, thank you. I see that Aliko Songolo has his hand up, and then after Aliko's question, there's one in the Q&A from Marissa Morman that we'll go to next. Aliko.
Yes, thank you very much for this very complex philosophical exploration into important issues of independence and survival in a way. And I'm quite intrigued by the guideposts of your talk, which go through philosophy, literature. I did not know that Lumumba wrote poetry, politics, history, and so forth. But I would like to focus a little bit on what might constitute the survival of dreams, which you talked about. I know that, yes, dreams have to survive. Dreams of independence and complete freedom and so forth have to survive. But what will make them survive is not totally clear. And I was, as you were talking about all that, I was thinking particularly about two things. One of them is, you might call them institutions. One of them is Atelier de la Pensée, in which you participate, and what it does to the survival of dreams, if it contributes to the survival of dreams. And the second, which happened just, I think, last week, or perhaps it's still happening, I don't know, that's the Franco-African Summit. And the Franco-African Summit is a great change from what it used to be. It used to be that African heads of states are invited by the French head of state to talk about Africa, but really, they were not really talking about Africa. They were really being, the Africans were just being reassured that they can stay in power. But the latest call by Macron to bring in the youngsters, and perhaps you were there or perhaps you are there, I don't know, is a great change, which may help the survival of the dream. So my question is not precise. I'm just asking you to comment on all those guideposts and those events.
Yeah, it's a very, I was torn by all those problems that we have now, and I am completely, your question is politically difficult, but let's start by the beginning. What I wanted to do, and I read very fast my lecture because when I heard that I only had 30 minutes and it was longer, I was quite stressed. But what I wanted to do is to talk about the legacy. And one of the thing is that I wanted to understand how I want to understand how the idea of diaspora can embody such a legacy, or can be understood through the legacy or the survival of political dreams. And in the book I'm writing, there are very material examples of that, and taken from for example, my own biography from my when I was born in Belgium, when I grew up in a family from people who lived in exile from the Mobutism regime, and I have lived in this complete reorganization of the diaspora, for example, in Brussels, in a political way. So the question was not what is it to be African, or what is it to be Congolese, but what do we want for the Congo? And this was this question of political aim that completely shaped the idea of diaspora and the kind of diaspora I have lived in. And so the survival of dream is to show how sometimes you have great ideas that were held to be dead that are still surviving in the movement and the displacement sometimes of the people in other countries, and in the way they are telling stories to their children that keep on telling those stories to their children. And it was this kind of legacy, or very intimate or sometimes collective, that I call Laetitia Africana. That is to say, in a very post-colonial or non-decolonial way, that the defeat were not complete because people could still tell their stories and give their stories as a legacy perhaps to their children. And this is what I wanted to point out. And this is very interesting to do it through, some feminist theorists, because all the many feminist theories have been able to just see very precisely what is happening in this place that is usually undermined by big theories, that is the place of the family, the place of the home, what are telling the mothers, the fathers to their children, and what kind of legacies or linked are they building with their children or inside their communities. And this is what I wanted to talk about. And to say and to undermine a frozen conception of the failed independence by saying that those independents, yes, we all see that they perhaps have failed, but they still survive through the stories and the dreams that are told by in the families, and that have sometimes traveled through the continent, through the seas, and in the diasporas. This is what I wanted to say. And it's important for me because in a very I'm not Afro-pessimistic at all in the theoretical sense, but it's not possible for me to draw the idea of Africa as the idea of the continent where no dreams, no utopias were completely created, or even where it's not possible to have a kind of history of utopia. And the independence, the poems I read, are shaping this idea of a history of utopia that took place in the continent. So when we say that, of course, you talk about the Atelier de la Pensée, and we can, of course, think immediately of the book of my great friend Felwine Sarr called Afrotopia. And Afrotopia is not a book that is reading the archives of the African history. It's a book that is trying to intertwine the present and the future, and to create new utopias. So in this way, of course, I think that there is something that is very interesting in Felwine Sarr's book, and that is perhaps a kind of, that can be seen as an expression of Laetitia Africana. I would say that the idea of les Ateliers de la Pensée has something to do with this Laetitia, because it is about how to create a space in Africa where we can think of the world. Usually the world is thinking of Africa, about Africa, and trying to create Africa as an object. But for the first time, not for the first time, but in the case of Les Ateliers de la Pensée, there is something like we are going to grasp the world from this place that is Dakar, and from other places, because there are other places in Africa where you have some projects like that of gathering intellectuals and sometimes activists or artists. So it could be an expression of that. It could be an expression of the survival of dreams, even in a very symbolic and intellectual way. And after, you have the very difficult question of our contemporary, very contemporary political time, and of what is happening in France in this Franco-African summit. I didn't want to express myself publicly about that because a lot of my close friends are involved in this summit. I was asked to be there, and I have to confess that I said no. I was asked, it's going to be registered, so recorded, so I don't know if I can tell everything, but I said no, not because I don't think that African intellectuals should not work with a French president. Not because of that. Not because of a certain purity of the intellectual mind that has nothing to do with the political affair. Not because I am rooted or completely frozen, in a very old and vintage understanding of what should be the so-called liberation of the African continent. Not because of that, but because of the time of this summit that is completely trapped in the political French time, that is the time of the presidential campaign. And I don't want, as a university, as a scholar, I don't want to be involved in the politician campaign, in the presidential campaign of any candidate of my country, not because I hate them all, that has nothing to do with an affective position, but as an intellectual, I don't have to be involved in a presidential campaign. Second, in France, the Black intellectuals, Arab intellectuals, Muslim intellectuals, or intellectuals that are rooted in an African background were targeted, even if they belong to, even if they try to understand the colonial history or the in a post-colonial way. You can use the word you want, but they were targeted as Islamo-gauchist, and there was a huge campaign against people in the universities, like me, for example, that were targeted by the government. And we have a big explosion of racism, hate speeches in France that is at the core, that was provoked by the government we have since 5 years. So I think for those reasons, and for the fact that the diaspora, it's very funny to see how a government that is so close to the idea of republic, to the idea that we have to be completely swallowed by the republic, that we cannot express our difference. He's talking about the French citizenship that have African roots as a diaspora. That's a complete contradiction. But it was difficult for me as a French, this is what I am now, intellectual, to believe in this summit because of the political context that we have, that we face now in my country. So I would say that this Franco-African summit for me is not the survival of dreams, because it is trapped in a very hateful context that is very hard for many intellectuals at the time now. That's what I wanted to say. Perhaps it's wrong, but that's why. So I completely disconnect perhaps the Atelier de la Pensée and this summit, even if it is the greatest intellectual, Achille Mbembe, and I understand why he did that, and I think it was important to try, but from my perhaps point of view, because I am not living in Africa now, but living perhaps in living in France, it was difficult because of this context to be able to get involved in such a summit. But it is a very important discussion, and we cannot have a caricatural. This conflict cannot be caricatured because it is a very important question. I think that perhaps the Franco-African summit has a lot to create. I don't know if it is possible because of the context I am talking about. So perhaps I am a very careful person, and this political situation has to be understood very carefully. This is my point of view, and of course, I completely look and listen to all the opinions about this summit, the people that were involved in this summit, that do participate to it, their dreams also, and the persons who refuse to be part of it. But it's a very important question. And I think we should have a lot of great discussions about what happened those 2 days ago. I don't know, Adiko Songolo, if I could answer to your question, but I'm completely in this in this moment. So I tried to be as honest as I could.
You answered it abundantly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and Marissa Mormon has a question here in the Q&A. I think everyone can see it, but I will ask it. Can you say a bit more about how the waking dream or the lucid dream works differently from what you call dream as ideal, or is often referred to in the context of African independent projects as utopias, which have become easy to dismiss?
Yeah, it's a very, very important question. I didn't talk at all about the question of perhaps African socialism or this kind of Marxism, for example, and for just one reason, not because it is not because they are not important, but because the weak answer first. I was really into the understanding of Lumumba, not as an icon, but I wanted to understand what happened, how it is possible to read his relationship with Kasavubu, and how it was possible to create a kind of philosophy of independence. But your question points something very important, and that is not here in this lecture, but I am working on, is of course the rebellion that came after in the Congo after the death of Lumumba, the question of the Maquis and of Pierre Moulele and the way their ideology was embodied or in Marxism. And I think that I don't want to work especially on, for example, African socialism. That is not at the core of the book I'm writing. That is completely rooted in the question of the Central Africa and in the decolonization. But I think that the question of the rebellion and the reading of the fight of Pierre Moulele and all those figures like perhaps Léonie Abo, etc., are very important to understand those survival of dreams. And we have to be, when you have such a defeat like the independence of the Congo and such a dictatorship that came and that tried to reshape the memory of this moment of decolonization and also the image of Lumumba himself, it is important to be able to focus on points of survival. So you have those rebellion that must be reread, I think, philosophically, their ideologies also. So you're right, completely right with your question, but it is here in a very specified context. And you have also perhaps all those moments of those points of rebellion. I think about the May 69, the June 69, sorry, I was mixing May 68 and June 69 in the Congo, that are all examples of this survival of dreams of the time of decolonization. And after, through that, how do they travel? How is it possible to show the way they could survive through, of course, expressions of new projects, as said Professor Aliko Songolo, or through ideologies, or even perhaps through I don't know, more intimate spaces. So to answer precisely to your question, I would say that it's important perhaps to not, I won't focus on a general understanding of African socialism as an expression of waking dreams, but just for my project to be able to reread this moment of the rebellion through a certain philosophical gaze. This is what is absolutely at the core of my work. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I wanted to thank you, Yala, so much for this excellent talk and this excellent discussion. And hopefully we'll have a chance to continue this in the future, and hopefully you'll be able to actually make it to Madison at some point. And then you're,
yeah, I would love to.
Host you here.
I would love to. I want to thank you very much for your invitation. I hope I didn't talk too fast, because I can do this kind of mistake sometimes. And I hope that you enjoyed it. And please don't be too hard with me. This is a writing process, so I was happy to receive all your questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.